You can destroy a person in exactly two ways. The first is obvious. The second is to get close enough that nobody questions your authority, nobody questions your motives. And by the time they realize what's happening, you're already inside the decision-making apparatus. You're the last voice he hears before sleep. You're the person who controls the chemistry of his body. You're not the villain in his story. You're the only person who understands. On June 25, 2009, the world lost Michael Jackson, but Michael Jackson had been disappearing for years before that. And one man was there for most of it. His name was Conrad Murray. And understanding how one physician became the final architect of an icon's collapse tells us something unsettling about power, proximity, and how the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous. This is not a story about malice. It's worse. It's a story about what happens when ambition, desperation, and access combine in a confined space. This is how empires crumble from the inside. Let's establish something first. Michael Jackson in 2000 was not the same person as Michael Jackson in 1982. Nobody's ever the same person twice. But Michael Jackson's second life was visibly different, to failed marriages, allegations that had scarred him in ways the world could measure, in canceled tours and erratic behavior. A man who had spent his entire existence being watched now seemed to be watching himself from somewhere very far away. The scrutiny hadn't ended. If anything, it had calcified into something permanent. A permanent question mark hanging over his entire existence. By 2008, Michael Jackson was preparing for something called the This Is It residency. 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London, 50 nights, a comeback that was supposed to cement his legacy, silence his critics, restore what had been taken. He was also 50 years old. Which doesn't sound particularly old until you realize it was older than anyone expected him to be. His body had been under industrial-level scrutiny for decades. Multiple surgeries, chronic pain, sleep deprivation that had begun not in his 50s, but in his 20s when he learned that resting meant being vulnerable. This is where Conrad Murray enters, not as a villain, as the answer to a very specific prayer. Murray was a cardiologist, a real doctor with real credentials. Not some fringe character but a board-certified physician who had treated celebrities and had a reputation of accessibility, of discretion, of understanding that famous people had problems that couldn't be solved in a normal hospital under the fluorescent light of scrutiny. Jackson needed someone who could manage pain. Murray was someone who could be managed, someone who was grateful for the proximity, someone who was being paid $3 million a year to be present, to be the solution. That's not speculation. That's the contract. What people don't understand about addiction is that it's not a moral failing. It's a math problem. Your body adapts. The dose that worked on Monday doesn't work on Tuesday. By Wednesday you need something stronger. By Thursday you need something new. The architecture of addiction is built on incremental adjustments that seem reasonable when you're making them in isolation. Michael Jackson had a documented insomnia problem that dated back decades. This wasn't insecurity or neurosis. Sleep deprivation, at the level he was experiencing, is a medical emergency. It causes hallucinations, paranoia, deterioration of every system in the body. For years, his insomnia was managed through pharmaceutical means, through various doctors offering various solutions. Propofol was not his first option. Propofol was the inevitable conclusion of a series of escalations. Propofol is used in hospitals. It's a powerful anesthetic. You use it to put people under. For surgery, it's effective, it works, and it absolutely should not be administered outside of a hospital setting. This is not ambiguous medical guidance. This is consensus. This is basic protocol. Conrad Murray administered it anyway, in Jackson's home, through and for, while the patient slept. And here's the architecture that matters. Murray didn't wake up one day and decide to become destructive. He became essential. Jackson couldn't sleep without him, couldn't perform without him, couldn't function. The relationship became a closed loop. The doctor became the drug. The fix became the problem. Murray had financial incentive to keep Jackson performing, able to perform, and dependent on his services. The This Is It tour was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Murray was making $3 million a year. If Jackson canceled, Murray's income evaporated. If Jackson performed, Murray remained essential. That is not a neutral incentive structure. That is a direct conflict of interest baked into every clinical decision. The This Is It rehearsals were not private. Directors were there, choreographers, sound engineers, lighting technicians, dozens of people. And they saw it. They saw Michael Jackson struggling, exhausted, requiring medical intervention between takes. One choreographer described him as not right. Another noted that he was on medication that was making him dependent. The evidence of deterioration was visible to everyone in the room except the people with the authority to stop it. This is the machinery. The machinery is not one person making one bad decision. The machinery is a system where the incentives are aligned toward continuation regardless of consequences. Jackson's tour promoters needed this tour to happen. They had sold tickets, made commitments. Any delay or cancellation represented financial devastation. They were not asking questions about his health because they didn't want to know the answers. Jackson's team, his managers, his handlers, his business advisors, they were similarly positioned. Jackson was their income. His ability to perform was their income. Everyone in the ecosystem had incentive to keep him functional, keep him on stage, keep him moving toward June 2009. And in the center of this system was one man, one physician, who had the authority to regulate Jackson's body, who had the access, who had the opportunity. The math was not complicated. Jackson needed sleep. Murray provided it. The method was catastrophic, but the method was not questioned because questioning it meant losing access, losing relevance, losing the $3 million a year. This is the part that most accounts of Jackson's death miss. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of micro-decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation. First, traditional sleep aids, those stopped working. Then, stronger medications, those became ineffective. Then experimental combinations, then higher dosages, then methods that required medical monitoring, then methods that required constant monitoring. Murray documented some of this, toward the end. He was waking Jackson repeatedly throughout the night to assess his condition. Jackson was sleeping, in fragments, while being chemically restrained. He was awake but not present, functional but deteriorating. The rehearsal footage from 2009 shows a man who is not well. Frame by frame, take by take, getting worse. And nobody stopped it. The director didn't say no. The choreographer didn't say no. The promoters didn't say no. The management didn't say no. Only the doctor had the authority to stop it. And the doctor had the most to lose if he did. June 25, 2009, 4 in the morning. Jackson couldn't sleep naturally anymore. That capacity had eroded. What remained was chemical sleep, induced unconsciousness, maintenance through pharmaceutical means. Murray administered the propofol, set up a makeshift for system in a bedroom, left the room. When he returned, Jackson was not breathing. His heart had stopped. The drug had depressed his respiratory system to the point of cessation. CPR was performed. It didn't work. The damage was already done. The question people ask is, did Murray intend this? Was it murder or negligence or something else? But intent is almost irrelevant at this point. The architecture was the crime. The system was the crime. The conflict of interest was the crime. A physician whose financial security depended on his patient's ability to perform was administering powerful anesthetics in a non-medical setting to treat a condition that should have been treated by a dressing. The underlying cause was that Jackson was not physically capable of performing 50 consecutive concerts. His body couldn't do it. His sleep system had deteriorated past the point of pharmaceutical repair, but admitting this would have meant canceling the tour. And canceling the tour was not an acceptable outcome for anyone in the ecosystem. Here's what most documentaries and articles won't tell you directly. Michael Jackson was murdered by the system. Not by Conrad Murray specifically, though he was the instrument. Murdered by a machinery that had one setting. Continue. Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He served 2 years. His medical license was revoked. He became infamous. History reduced him to a villain, a cautionary tale, a bad doctor who did a bad thing. But the narrative misses something. Murray didn't invent the circumstances. He was positioned into them. He was given access to a desperate man with unlimited resources and no one willing to say no. He was offered a salary that far exceeded normal medical compensation. He was made essential. And then he was blamed. This is not an argument for Murray's innocence. This is an argument that reducing this to a single person's malice obscures the actual problem. The actual problem was systemic. The actual problem was that everyone involved, the tour promoters, the managers, the record labels, the choreographers, the directors, the entire apparatus surrounding Michael Jackson had aligned their financial interests toward his continued performance regardless of his health. Murray was the final node in that system. The point of contact where financial interest became medical practice, where conflicts of interest became irreversible consequences. People ask questions about how this was allowed to happen. How did nobody intervene? But this is the wrong question. People did see it. The footage from rehearsals is haunting. Directors noted his condition. Crew members talked. It was visible. The question is not how this was allowed to happen. The question is why visibility was not sufficient to stop it. And the answer is that everyone benefiting from Jackson's continued performance benefited more from his continued performance than they will have lost from his possible safety. The tour represented $600 million in revenue. Jackson was paid $85 million for 50 shows. His tour promoters made hundreds of millions. His management made percentages of everything. His label benefited from the publicity and the renewed relevance. And Maury made $3 million a year for providing a single service, keeping Jackson functional. Against that economic reality, the moral argument that he shouldn't perform because his body couldn't handle it was abstract, it was principled, it was unprofitable. Medical ethics is supposed to protect against this. A physician's primary obligation is to their patient's well-being. The Hippocratic Oath exists because this is not always intuitive, because financial interest and patient health can be misaligned. Murray had complete access to Jackson's body, complete control over his medical care, and a financial incentive that made Jackson's continued functionality worth more than his actual health. This is not a gap in the system. This is a design flaw that was never addressed. To this day, there is no regulation preventing a physician from being the sole healthcare provider to a celebrity patient while also being financially dependent on that patient's ability to perform. To this day, there is no mandate that a patient this vulnerable, this medicated, this compromised must have independent medical oversight, multiple doctors checking the work of other doctors, advocates ensuring the patient's voice is heard. Jackson had zero of those protections. He had one doctor, one man, and that man's bank account was on the line every day. Murray became the face of this tragedy, the man who destroyed Michael Jackson. The narrative is clean, the villain is identified, the case is closed, but close your eyes for a moment and imagine a different timeline. Imagine a moment where someone said no, not Michael. He couldn't say no. He was desperate for sleep. He had convinced himself he could perform despite everything telling him he couldn't. Imagine a manager said no. Imagine a promoter said no. Imagine a second opinion from a cardiologist who wasn't being paid $3 million a year. Imagine a healthcare system that had inherent checks against this type of conflict of interest. That timeline existed. It was available. All of these interventions were possible. They didn't happen because the incentives were all aligned in one direction. Continue, perform, generate revenue. Michael Jackson's body gave out. His heart stopped, and one man was in the room. The question we should be asking is not about Conrad Murray specifically. It's about the conditions that made someone like him inevitable. If Michael Jackson had lived past June 25, 2009, he would have performed at the O2. The tour would have happened. The revenue would have been generated, and everyone in that ecosystem would have profited enormously. And very likely, his body would have broken down within weeks or months. The propofol would have continued. The sleep deprivation would have continued. The escalation would have continued, because the system was not designed to protect him. It was designed to extract value from him for as long as possible. The man who destroyed Michael Jackson was one person. But the system that made that destruction both possible and profitable was much larger. It included people who never met him, people who never knew his medical status, people who just benefited from his continued functionality. When we talk about Michael Jackson's death, we tend to focus on the tragedy, the loss of an icon, the waste of a talent, the cruelty of his final months. All of that is true, but there's another tragedy underneath it. The tragedy was that this was preventable, that at any point someone could have said no, could have chosen his actual well-being over his continued performance. They didn't, and one man became responsible for the entire system's failure. Conrad Murray administered the drug. That is factual. That is his responsibility. But he did not create the conditions that made that necessary. He did not create a financial system where his income depended on Jackson's ability to perform. He did not create a tour structure that demanded an aging, deteriorating man perform 50 consecutive nights. He did not position himself at the center of an ecosystem that had zero accountability to anyone. Other than profit margins, he was given access to a desperate man. He was given authority over that man's body. He was given financial incentive to extend that authority as far as possible. And he did what the system incentivized him to do. The tragedy is not that one bad man emerged and destroyed Michael Jackson. The tragedy is that the system was designed in such a way that one man, acting within the incentives he was given, could destroy an icon. And the question we never quite answer is this: if you changed the man but kept the system, would the outcome have been different? That's the question that matters. That's the question that explains why Michael Jackson died at 50 years old on a Tuesday morning while a doctor administered an anesthetic in a bed room. The man who destroyed Michael Jackson had a name, he had a face, he had a trial, but the system that made his destruction necessary is still here, still operating, still positioning physicians in conflicts of interest, still extracting value from damaged bodies for profit. Michael Jackson is gone. Conrad Murray's life was destroyed. The system continues unchanged, and that might be the real tragedy of all of this.